consider. Sorry, consider. I thought that.
Adonai Elohim emet. ומלכותו ורצון קיבלו עליהם, ובני ישראל לחנו שירה ושמחה רבה במלכולם. מלכות קרבנך בוקיה לפני משה זה אלי הנביא אדוני לא ונאמר כי פדה אדוני יעקב וגאלו מיד חזק ממנו ברוך אתה אדוני גאל ישראל. ושמור צאתנו ואלוהינו שלום יתה ביד עולם ברוך אתה אדוני שומר עמו ישראל אמן.
Go, Rafi.
Mizrachi, Rabbi Mervis, Rabbanim, family and friends. Welcome to this commemoration of the 7th Yahrzeit of my late grandfather Erwin Lamm, Yitzchak ben Menachem Halevi, Zichrono Livracha, and the naming of this shul as Beit Yitzchak, or this shul next door, as Beit Yitzchak in his memory, and that of my late grandmother, Ilse Lamm, Alea HaShalom. Tonight I would like to share with you a few of the attributes of my late grandparents that I hope will be a source of meaning for the Kehillah as we enjoy the use of this fantastic binyan in the years and decades to come. Opi, or Erwin Lamm, shared the name of the second of our avot being Yitzchak. While the Torah goes into great detail about the life and story of Avraham Avinu and Yaakov Avinu, the description of Yitzchak Avinu is much more limited. While at face value we might view Yitzchak in a less flattering light, given his apparent passivity and lack of creativity and action, this clearly does not do him justice. Rav Yosef Blau points out that in the Amidah we say, Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, ve'Elokei Yaakov. Each of the avot is worthy for us to daven to his God in his own right. Once again, it is similarly written, Zacharti et Briti Avraham, et Briti Yitzchak, etc., such that each of the avot was worthy of their own covenant with Hashem. Ve'elo todot Yitzchak ben Avraham, Avraham holidet Yitzchak. In the words of Rav Blau, the defining characteristic of Yitzchak was that he is the son of Avraham Avinu, or a continuation of Avraham. When Avraham was blessed after Sodom, it was on the basis that Laman asher yitzaveh et banav ve'et beito acharav. The tribute to Avraham Avinu was not just that he followed the ways of Hashem, but that he created the framework for his descendants to do so also. In semi-contrast, when Yitzchak is given the Brit after being instructed not to go to Mitzrayim, it is given on the basis of Ekev asher shama Avraham bekoli. Yitzchak is blessed because of Avraham's actions. When describing the digging of the berot of the wells, it is talked about redigging the wells already dug by Avraham. Vayashov Yitzchak v'yachpor et berot hamayim asher chafru bimei Avraham aviv. To enhance this emphasis on intergenerational connectivity in the story of Avraham and Yitzchak, let me refer to the Akedah, which I think was the highlight of this relationship between father and son. Rav Soloveitchik suggested that Yitzchak was the hero in the story rather than Avraham, as we commonly assume. While Avraham heard a command from Hashem, Yitzchak went along with it merely because his father told him to do so. Yitzchak established the concept of Masorah, of following what those who came before us say and do. Unlike the other Avot, Yitzchak's name never changed. Similarly, he never left Eretz Yisrael. He represented stability, continuity, loyalty, permanence, and self-sacrifice. Opi, in so many of his midot, was an exemplar of his namesake Yitzchak Avinu. For the Lamm family, but also for many members of Mizrachi and many of us here tonight, Opi was a key link in the chain of our Masorah, from the beliefs and practices and minhagim of our ancestors in Europe for over millennia. When Opi led his Baal Tefilla with tunes such as Yalev Yavo, B'tzeiti Mitzrayim, or Hodul Hashem Kitov, the Kehillah was taken back in a time bubble to the famous Shif Shul in Vienna. He displayed an excitement in learning and associating with Talmidei Chachamim that remained from his time as a yeshiva student in Europe. He loved sharing his stories in Divrei Torah with people in shul or on the way to and from shul. Yitzchak is perhaps the forefather most associated with Tefillah. Vayetze Yitzchak lasuach basadeh. And once again, when he prays for Rivka to fall pregnant, and his prayer is answered. For Opi, Tefillah was a serious business, and he believed strongly in punctuality, decorum, formal attire, close attention to the Kriya, and the rabbi's sermon, of course, and greeting everybody appropriately, normally before they had a chance to greet him. Similarly, shiurim were not to be missed, and he could never understand why anyone didn't come to hear shiurim from visiting rabbis or Talmidei Chachamim. Yitzchak was known for the attribute of gevura, or strength and self-control. Opi and Omi believed in this both in a physical sense with their regular gym sessions, and more fundamentally through their inner resilience in the face of extreme challenges and adversity. Even in his 90s, Opi had no difficulty standing with the Torah at the bima here for the whole of the Kol Nidrei service. In Hilchot Menachem, the Rambam holds that Yitzchak added the mitzvah of Masrot. Maser was first introduced by Avraham, but as a one-off, which Yitzchak made into a regular mitzvah. However, the source of mitzvah aseh and lot aseh of charity is in this week's Parasha Re'eh. Ki yeh b'cha evyon me'echad achecha. When you have a poor person amongst you, you cannot walk by and ignore their poverty. Omi and Opi felt very strongly about chesed and tzedakah, especially being involved in support of Israel, including collecting for UAA, Emunah, the revisionists, and Beit. Whenever a Jew in Melbourne publicly criticised Israel, they would receive an approach, normally a phone call from my grandfather to donate to the UAA. First he checked on the register with UAA to make sure they weren't already donors, but if they weren't, they'd immediately get approached. We are now in the Sheva de Nechemta, and Opi and Omi were true believers in Sion b'mishpat tipader v'shavea b'tzedakah. Jerusalem will merit rebuilding through the giving of charity. Opi was always troubled by the pasuk in benching of Nar hayiti v'gam zakanti v'lo ra'iti tzaddik ne'ezav v'zaru mavakesh lachem, that I have never seen a tzaddik abandon his descendants begging for bread. For we know that that has been the plight of many tzaddikim over time. Two answers that he gave to that question both give a perspective on his views towards charity. Firstly, that it doesn't mean that I've never seen a tzaddik abandoned, but rather I couldn't be comfortable with seeing this situation. Or alternatively, I have never seen this because when I saw that need arise, I intervened and assisted. Often, when there is an announcement of a major donation and a building dedicated by the donor, Opi would remind me that there is a havamina, that perhaps it is incorrect to publicise a donor so much by attaching their name to a building. But in fact, it is indeed the correct thing to do, and that is the conclusion of the Ramah Yoredea, Simon Reish Mem Tet, who says, based on the Rashba, Ra'ui Lasot Ken, not just that it's okay, but indeed it's the correct thing to do. I'm sure Opi never considered that perhaps it would be his name on the adjacent building where we had these discussions. I recently heard a shir by Rav Shai Shafter explaining the Ramah in some detail based on the Mishnah Masechet Bikurim, that when the farmers came from all over Israel to Yerushalayim to present their Bikurim, They were greeted by the shopkeepers and the townsfolk of Yerushalayim, partly to give the farmers encouragement to come again and do so next year. After all, it could have been a couple of weeks' journey for the family to come to Yerushalayim. Similarly, for Staka, the reason that we support the naming of buildings is to encourage others to follow and give generously. Another example of that is allowing people, or doctors or Hatzalah workers, to return on the Shabbos after they perform their tasks, again to encourage them to do so in the future, amongst other reasons that it's permitted. In contrast, with regards to the building of the Mishkan, it says, "V'hamlacha hayta dayam l'kol hamlacha la'asot otah ve'hoter." For the stuff that they had was enough for all the work to make it, and some was left. Opi would say that excess funds was raised for the building of the Mishkan, so no one could say that without me such and such part of the building wouldn't have been possible. Tonight we fondly remember Omi and Opi as outstanding role models for us, their family, but also for the wider community. We hope that Beit Yitzchak will reflect the special attributes of Yitzchak Avinu that were passed down to us by Omi and Opi, of loyalty to the Masorah of their parents, grandparents and ancestors. Respect and love for the traditions and minhagim they brought from the Gedolim of yesteryear in Europe. May their devotion to Am Yisrael, Eretz Yisrael and Torah Yisrael continue to inspire our tefillot and learning in this binyan here and next door for the years and generations to come. It is now my pleasure to invite the Moradatra of Nervous to address us.
Gloria.
At the outset, Rafi, it suits you up here. Shkoyach for your excellent words which suited the occasion. And I'd like to thank you and Ilse together with Danny and Rolene for your tremendous leadership which you provide for our community, for your great generosity in the naming of Beit Yitzchak, and your great generosity across the board for everything you do for our community, for your personal friendship and support, and for the opportunity to share some words this evening. I recall almost 7 years ago, Altea and I, together with, at the time, our two children, Rafi and Leora, visited Melbourne for the Yamim Noraim, ahead of my appointment as Rosh Kollel. On that visit, I gave a number of shiurim in different places. One of them was a shiur on Yom Kippur after Kol Nidre in the Kinders. That is where the joint Nachalat David and Beit Midrash Minyan were davening. They were davening in the Kinder because we did not have an appropriate space to hold such a minyan, such as Beit Yitzchak, which we are dedicating this evening. And in that shiur which I delivered, there was one person who stood out. It was a bearded gentleman who listened with great intent, who followed every single word of the shiur, who then asked some very relevant questions as well. And this person, I came to learn, was called Danny Lamm, and he had a beard because he was in Avelut, and his father, his revered late father, had recently passed away. The next day, somebody in their late 30s approached me in Shul, holding on to a book. That book was a Sefer Minhagim. The person said, "I am a son of Danny Lamm." I don't remember if it was Rafi or David, but they said, "My father sent me to you to show you something in this book." And they pointed me to a certain page in the Sefer, which referenced something which I had discussed in the shiur the previous evening. I then sent a message back to Danny with this son, answering the point which had been raised there. And then later on, the son comes back to me with Danny's response, and we had this back and forth in words of Torah. This was my introduction to the Lamm family. And it was one which made a deep impression on me for a number of reasons. First of all, here we have a family which has a deep connection with Torah and Torah learning. If there is a guest speaker, many people might go home, let's say to their Shabbat table, and they'll ask, how did the speaker speak? How did the rabbi speak? In the Lamm home, the question is not, how did the rabbi speak? The question is, what did the rabbi say? It is a family which values content above style, And when Danny tells me that his late father would have enjoyed my shiurim, I know those words are delivered as a tremendous compliment, and they are received as a great compliment as well. Secondly, we have a family with exceptional devotion to our minhagim. As Rafi discussed the passage of our Masorah, the book that was being held and being brought to me was a Sefer Minhagim, a book of our customs. And this is a family which understands the primacy of our minhagim in terms of determining our Jewish identity today and knowing what we need to cherish in order to ensure our Jewish future. The third thing which stood out for me was this great expression of kibud horim, honoring your parents. Here you have somebody in their late 30s, an already established individual who has no problem at all running backwards and forwards, delivering messages on behalf of their father. This is the great kibud horim which Danny and Rolene's children all have, which they in turn have learned from their parents. And if we want to know where all of these qualities come from, I believe we have an answer in the Haftarah, which we read this past Shabbat, the Haftarah for Ekev, where Yeshaya tells us, Habitu el tzur chutzavtem, look to the rock from which you were hewn. And in the next pasuk he tells us, Habitu el Avraham avichem, ve'el Sarah techol elchem, look to Avraham your forefather, and to Sarah who gave birth to you. Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook would often quote these words, and he would evoke them and say these aren't just words of general guidance and advice, but this is a command, it's a lashon sivui, habitu, we must look. We must look to our forefathers and foremothers, to our patriarchs and matriarchs in the way which Rafi did before, and emulate their ways. We must understand that each of us is a chip off an old block. We are all just pebbles and stones who have broken off from the great rocks which came before us. We must look to our family origins, our communal origins, and our national history in order to understand who we are today and where we should go in the future. This evening, we dedicate Beit Yitzchak, which is being done so in memory of two towering figures. And Danny and Rolene, together with Gilda and Alex, and the children, grandchildren, are all blessed to be able to look to the matriarch and patriarch of their family with great pride. They can look at two individuals whose lives were dedicated to Eretz Yisrael, Am Yisrael, and Torah Yisrael. And these weren't just things that they believed in theory or spoke about, but they were involved in leadership and giving and action on behalf of these values. And they were two individuals who were first and foremost family people. Althea and I feel it was a great privilege to know Mrs. Lamm and to know her well, and also to have a strong relationship not only with her, but with every generation of her family, her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. And in her words that she wrote in a book called Voices from the Melbourne Jewish Community, she wrote, I am proud that all of my grandchildren and their spouses are Orthodox Jews, and that all of them are involved in some voluntary capacity in the community. I am most proud of the fact that my children and their spouses have all been involved in Jewish communal life. I have 14 great-grandchildren, that number has since grown, and feel sure that they too will make great contributions to the community. Now with the naming of Beit Yitzchak, it is not only the members of the Lamm family who can look back to these two great individuals for inspiration. The name Beit Yitzchak will remind us all and be a physical presence for us all that we should all look back to these great individuals. Yehi Zichram Baruch. May their memory continue to be a great blessing and a source of guidance and inspiration for the family and now for us all for many years to come.
Yeah.
Bershut Harav, Rabbanim Mechubadim, I'd like to begin by thanking Rolene, Danny, Rafi and Ilse Lamm for their generosity and support of Mizrachi and for the dedication this evening. As we are honouring the memory of Ilse and Erwin Lamm Zichronam Livracha this evening, I also wanted to share some personal reflections. I long admired the way they conducted themselves, always with great dignity and respect. Their commitment to our traditions, both publicly and privately, served as an example to all of those around them. And I will always remember the times Mr. Lamm would pull me aside to share a word of Torah or a nigun from the Alter Haim. From the perspective of the president of Mizrachi, I believe there is also much we can learn. Ilse and Erwin Lamm Zichronam Livracha were at Mizrachi, Melbourne from the start. They were not only witnesses to seminal moments in Jewish history, but also witnessed the tremendous accomplishments of our great organisation. From the establishment of the first religious Zionist shul in Melbourne, the establishment of a religious Zionist school, a kosher certification authority, a Zionist youth movement, a Beit Midrash, and so much more, all under the auspices of World Mizrachi, the World Mizrachi movement. And there were also times when they stood their ground to ensure that our Merkaz Ruchani and its ideology remained strong. They were part of a generation of builders who through commitment and sacrifice participated and supported the growth of one of the world's most vibrant Jewish communities in one of the world's most distant countries. They are an example of a family that invested in Mizrachi across the generations. In Ilse and Erwin Lamm Zichronam Livracha, we see the establishment of strong roots in our community, from which grew 4 generations so far of Mizrachi members. As an organisation, I believe that we should take great inspiration and pride in that. It is especially fitting that the space that we are dedicating as Beit Yitzchak is for our young adults, so that every time they walk through the door of their shul, they can be reminded of the importance of family, tradition, and community. May we all be zocher to follow in their example.
Good evening, everyone. Firstly, I'd like to thank Danny for inviting me to say a few words on behalf of Or David, who will be using the Beit Yitzchak complex. I've always been taught that in order to create the future, you need to understand your past. And I don't think this could be truer at the moment for Kehilat Or David. The Kehilat Or David minyan is named after the late Danny Plaque, who had a vision for a minyan for young adults. And now, we will have the great honour of having our regular minyanim and activities in the Beit Yitzchak complex. It's a real privilege for Kehilat Or David to be able to daven in a place named after Erwin and Ilse Lamm, 2 individuals who laid the foundations for what we have today. I also think it's quite fitting that a place which hosts daily minyanim will have the name Beit Yitzchak. I know from my experiences growing up and from what people have told me, Erwin always felt at home in shul, and the name Beit Yitzchak will be a constant reminder that Erwin is always part of our tefillah. Kehilat Or David will hopefully produce the next generation of Mizrachi leaders who will continue to lead our wonderful organisation to new heights. It is my hope that Kehilat Or David will ensure all the hard work of Erwin and Ilse and the entire Lamm family to make sure that we will continue at this special place for many years to come.
President, 14, 15 years worth. It's a peculiar time because of this COVID situation, and as a result, the shul has had a period of inactivity, of closure. And this last Shabbos, we laid 2 parashiot, although we weren't meant to lay 2 parashiot. We lay Vaychanan and Ekev. to make up at least for one of the parashiot that we missed out on. And the rabbi was asked a question about how the parashiot should be divided up. And he proffered two alternatives. One is that the first parasha is read in its entirety and then continues on to the kohen of the next parasha, and then the next 6 aliyot are called up, or alternatively it could be divided up so that we'd have the bridging aliyah at the Revi'i. And in the minyan that I was designated to daven, because we have to daven in different spaces, fortunately for me, I had a rather unique experience in being called up Levi. Levi was Shlishi and Revi of Beit Hanan. I managed to get called up for the Aseret HaDibrot. An absolutely unique experience for someone who's a Kohen or a Levi as I am. And I was very excited about that. And Yehuda was the Gabbai, so he made that happen, Shkoach Yehuda. And Yehuda's our vice president, by the way. And in the reading of the Aseret HaDibrot, I was particularly sort of drawn to the mitzvah of Kabed et Avicha ve'et imecha, because I had that aliyah in advance of the Yahrzeit tonight and the Yahrzeit of my father. And I was thinking about that Kabed et Avicha ve'et imecha that has been expressed, and thinking that Gilda and I were exposed to a home environment where that kibbud that was given to parents was demonstrated all the time. It was either demonstrated in the context of my maternal grandfather, who had got out of Europe in time to avoid the terrible Holocaust that followed, and the respect given to him by our parents, and the reverence in which my father described his parents, who unfortunately, tragically were murdered in Auschwitz, but that he had learned so much from them, and that was passed on to us. My father didn't recover from the loss and what had taken place, but somehow he and so many other incredible people hung on to their faith. And my father and my mother were both really happy people. It could be described as mi ha'ish hechafetz chaim ohev yamim lirot tov. They desired life and they loved the days and sought to do good. Shul, this shul, for them, was another home. They were incredibly committed to shul life. And the background, which has been briefly covered, particularly by Raf, of whom we are so proud, and my parents were so proud of their children and all their grandchildren. The background was this famous shul, the Schiff Shul, in the 2nd district of Vienna, and which was just full of Jews. Before the Holocaust, before the war, there was something between 200 and 220,000 Jews that lived in Vienna out of a population of 2 million. And both my father and my mother came from Vienna. This shul was a towering shul of a Ashkenazi background. And my father went to Galanta Yeshiva, which is one of the 2 great yeshivot that were in the Austria-Hungarian, Slovakian environment. And he had an incredible memory. Everything he learnt, he remembered. and which was sometimes a challenge for speakers because he knew what was right and wasn't quite accurate. And then coming out here on the famous Danira and landing up in Hay and Tatura, this was a remarkable thing. It was remarkable because for that period of time of 2 years, there was a yeshiva set up in that camp. They had amazing experiences. He did his matriculation there, but they also had a yeshiva with really serious rabbonim there to learn from. So the learning just continued. In 1942, the Australians suddenly discovered that these people that they had incarcerated in these camps were not the enemy, and they came to them and said that if you agree to join the army, to be enlisted, you'll be released immediately. My father was one of those who did that, and he served in the Australia Employment Unit for 2 years. It was a unit involved with supply and distribution. During that time, he was introduced to my mother because the base was not that far away from North Carlton, and there was a shidduch and there was a meeting, and without going into the background, they came from the identical background in Europe. And in 1944, on a request from the people who had established a shul called Beit, which was in Brighton Road, he was released from the army to be the first spiritual leader of that shul in 1944. And that shul, which had a wonderful reputation with serious Erlicher guys and people, then eventually became the Adas Yisrael that we know today. Unfortunately, some of the people who got involved at Adas at that stage were not happy about the Tefilla Lamdina, and as a result, my father and my late uncle Herbert left the minyan. I had an uncle called Shimmy Klein who had a minyan in his own home in number 58 Howard Road, and my father and uncle were part of that minyan, and there were others. There were Fagelins and Lieblers. There were quite a few people from the area. And then, as I've described at another time, but I won't go into it now, when the Mizrachi group, who were based in Carlton, approached Shimmy Klein whether he would agree to combine the minyanim, he agreed, and in 1951 we established Mizrachi in south of the Yarra here, and in 1957 we moved here, and my father was part of that all the way through. There was a reference to my father's interest in learning and the messages that came through from friends who talked about having the opportunity to walk with Dad to shul, or women who walk with Mum and were always engaged in interesting conversation. My father could be described as Ashrei Ha'ish, She'yishma le'mitzvotecha, v'toratcha u'dvarcha yasim al libo. The words of the Torah, the mitzvot, were embedded in him. And because he loved learning so much, and he did it every day, there was always something to pass on, and he was very keen to pass on different thoughts. He was a committed Zionist, and it's never sort of been openly discussed, but my late grandfather and my father were involved in support of the Irgun before the state. Ad kedei kach, that more than 30 years later we found out they were being monitored by ASIO the whole time, when the papers got declassified. Because he believed that you have to stand up and fight. He had He hadn't, but Herbert had heard Jabotinsky speak and was absolutely convinced in his ideology, and that passed on to my father, and it so happened to my grandfather had it as well. So my father always used to quote a pasuk that we read a little bit differently in our Siddurim, but in the Siddur of Rav Shamshon, Raphael Hirsch, the delineation of the pasuk is slightly different. We say Eila Barecha ve'Eila Basusim, and then we say V'anachnu b'Shem Hashem Elokeinu naskir. But in Rav Hirsch's Siddur it says Eila Barecha ve'Eila Basusim v'anachnu, and then there's a psik. And my father would always tell people, and one of the people that I passed it on to was Rav Yosef Tzvi Rimon, who was quite impressed with it. They've got chariots, and they've got phantoms, and they've got whatever weapons they've got. V'anachnu, and we do as well. We have them as well. And we're prepared to fight. Then, B'Shem Hashem Elokeinu naskir. There are many other quotes I can bring you about such messages. Their involvement, as Rafi described, for UAA and the revisionists, Likud, Mizrachi, State Science Council. My father was a vice president of the JCCV. He was in the vanguard of that support for the establishment of a Jewish day school, the involvement in WZO, and he was on the board of governors of Jaffe. Mum's involvement in reform meals, that some people remember very, very fondly, for its support of people who needed meals in hospital. For Emunah, for Mount Scobus, for Yeshiva, all of those things were part and parcel of their life. Matan referred to Kilat Or David, and when I told Matan in the first place that we were going to invest in the name of Beit Yitzchak, he was very excited on the spot. There is an expression, Tzadikim b'motam kruyim chayim. Righteous people in their passing are considered to be alive, kruyim chayim. It's not that I want to say that my father was a tzaddik. That's for other people to say. But he was incredibly committed to Yiddishkeit and to a way of life that he loved. He was governed by Lishmor, Lilmod, Lamed, Lishmor, Velasot. And I think for him and those people of Beit Haroeh who were formerly in that space will recall that my father used to come in regularly to hear the drasha. He'd hear one drasha here, he'd go in there, and Reb Lior was usually the one that was giving it at that particular point in time, but there have been others, and I welcome you here, Rav Chezi, as the rabbi of that shul. And he would go in there and would really enjoy being part of it, and it didn't concern him that everybody was, at great-grandchild age level, because he had a very strong commitment to the youth. So I think for mum and dad, for all our family, the idea that this space is called Beit Yitzchak and it'll be associated with the growth of the younger members of our community, I think that my father and Shemayim will be applauding this honour that Mizrachi has given him in being associated. Finally, I'd like to thank all of you for coming here tonight to honour our late parents, to honour us by being part of it. We were very restricted in numbers, and I apologise to all those who would have liked to come with wives, and we had to be fairly limited for that reason. I want to thank Rafi for his insightful address, Rabbi Mervis for his, and notwithstanding the fact that he didn't have the opportunity to meet Dad. Within a year of his being here, he told me he'd listened to a USB which had an interview of several hours. I think Miriam Muntz, you had something to do with that. And he, just off his own bat, took upon himself to hear about Dad. And I very much, we all very much appreciated your interest in that way. To David Brickman, who we wish every success going forward, and to Matan for your words. I hope you'll, Matan, you'll show them to your grandparents. That's important. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming. Rabbi Gutnick, Rabbi Gutnick did have a relationship with my father, and as I did with the late Rabbi Chaim Gutnick, and there was a lot of respect. Rabbi Chaim Gutnick was a Likudnik as well, actually, so it was only appropriate. Thank you very much. We're going to now go outside and just look at the plaque and invite you to have a l'chaim outside. Thank you very much.
Oh, yeah.